Less than 2 weeks ago, Melissa Perez was shot and killed by 3 San Antonio police officers when she was in her own house behind a locked door. She had 4 children, 3 of whom are still minors. One of them was only 9 years old. Her death was tragic, senseless, and unnecessary. Now, the offending officers have been taken into custody and charged with murder. And today, we have filed a civil lawsuit in federal court for Melissa Perez's wrongful death. Of course, we seek compensation for the family, but this case is much bigger than that. We also seek real and meaningful change in the way the police department operates. The police department needs to change the way it disciplines offending officers. It needs to make sure that bad actors are not reinstated and placed back out in the public. The police department needs to change its response to people who have mental illness so that they receive compassionate care rather than a paramilitary response. We're here for the long haul so that justice can be achieved, so that the family and our city can heal. Sergeant Flores never should have been wearing a police uniform that night. He was recommended for termination back in 2017 for being involved in some undisclosed disturbance that was bad enough for Chief McManus to recommend indefinite suspension, which is termination. And yet inexplicably he was reinstated and put back out in the public. Then he was disciplined for 1 day for pulling a gun on somebody who was tailgating him. Now, the police regulations say that you should never pull your service weapon unless the circumstances are dangerous enough to where you're authorized to pull the trigger. Well, you certainly can't pull the trigger on somebody for tailgating you, and yet Officer Flores wasn't disciplined for this at all. He got a 1-day suspension for not turning on his body camera. And so this was entirely predictable. You've got an officer who pulls his weapon when there's absolutely no reason to do so, and he should have been disciplined, reprimanded, and terminated. Instead, he was promoted to sergeant, and then he killed Melissa Perez. In order for the police to justify using deadly force, they have to have a reasonable belief that they are in imminent danger of serious bodily injury or death, and that just did not exist in this case. Ms. Perez was in her own house behind a locked door. She did have a hammer in her hand because she was afraid that the officers were going to come in, and she was experiencing an acute schizophrenic episode. We don't really have to debate whether or not their actions were reasonable because the police chief has already gone and publicly said that no reasonable police officer could have thought under these circumstances that they were in imminent danger of serious bodily injury. The district attorney agrees and has charged them with murder. The affidavit specifically says that there was no imminent threat to the officers or to anyone else. And so those who have looked at the evidence most carefully have made it clear that this was not self-defense. It was murder. This is not a case where the police discovered that the door was locked after the fact. They knew the door was locked before they opened fire. The body cam footage shows Officer Alejandro grab the doorknob and he can't open it. And remarkably, after he knows that she can't get to him, that there's no way for her to get through and pose any threat to him at all, he pulls his pistol and opens fire on her. We've all heard Chief McManus say that the training is perfect and the only problem is that the officers didn't follow the training that they had received. But this incident itself demonstrates that that cannot be true. We're not talking about some rogue police officer who in a split-second decision forgot his training. We're talking about 6 officers who were back behind that porch. 3 of them were pulling the trigger. One had his weapon drawn, and the other 2 just sat and watched this thing escalate until it spun out of control. Is the city really going to argue that all 6 of these officers suddenly and simultaneously forgot their training? No, the only way this happens is if there are real and systemic problems in the training and in the culture at the police department. Well, first, you don't have to be a doctor in order to recognize that Miss Perez was having a mental health crisis just by looking at the way she was acting on the body cam footage. She was terrified of those police officers. But more importantly, the affidavit supporting the arrest warrant for these three officers explicitly states that when the police got to the scene, she told them that she was cutting the wires to the fire alarm system because she thought the FBI was using that equipment to spy on her. So clearly she was having paranoid delusions, and she needed medical care, not a paramilitary response. They should have de-escalated immediately once they learned that she was afraid of law enforcement. You know, one of the things that bothers me a lot about this case is that this woman was having paranoid fears about law enforcement, the FBI. And so the worst thing that one could do is show up in a police uniform and point a gun at her and say, "You're going to get shot." Any of us would be nervous about that, but somebody who was paranoid the FBI was spying on her would react very badly to that. It's remarkable she didn't act even worse. She went into her house and locked the door, only to be gunned down. Well, there's two major problems. First, police officers in SAPD almost never get reprimanded or disciplined for their misconduct. I mean, there are 10 examples of excessive force in the complaint, most of them involving a police officer killing a citizen. And in 9 of them, the officers got absolutely no discipline whatsoever. And so it is a rampant problem where significant police misconduct goes unaddressed at all. The second problem is that even when there is a disciplinary action taken, and even when the officer is recommended for termination, the vast majority of the time they are reinstated with back pay. In fact, there's one study that says when Chief McManus recommends termination, almost 70% of the time they are reinstated with back pay. So that's got to change as well. I've heard from multiple sources that the rank and file SAPD officer does not respect the mental health team. They're not viewed as real cops, and they don't get called. Part of the reason they're not called is because they never respond. They're not available almost all the time. Retired officers from the mental health team say they've heard that the SAPD officer says, "Why would we call you? You're never here. You never come. You never show up. We're just going to do this ourselves." So there's a major problem with the availability of the officers even during the daytime hours. But the bigger problem is that the mental health team shuts down at 11 p.m. And as in this case, people experience mental health crises after midnight. And so the mental health team is not even available during those hours. And so that's got to change. So we know that Melissa Perez was not actually in police custody, but we know that the city of San Antonio has a major problem with escalating situations until the person dies, because so many of our citizens die while they're in police custody. Every time a person dies, the report goes to a database with the Texas Attorney General's office. And there have been activists here in San Antonio that have analyzed that data and concluded that almost one person every month dies while in police custody. That's got to change. That's on par with cities that are much larger, like Chicago and Houston. One of the important aspects of our complaint is that it attaches and includes a November 2021 written request by Mario Salas, two-time council member for the city of San Antonio, now a professor at UTSA. And he makes some explosive allegations in his request for an investigation that he sent to Merrick Garland of the Department of Justice. He says that the police union has been harassing and threatening citizens who complain about police brutality. He says they're threatening them with felony perjury charges or other crimes that would stack, and basically threatening these individuals that if they continue to complain about police brutality, they're going to get the book thrown at them. And he claims in his letter that when that happened, the complaints about police misconduct went down significantly. And he's asked the Justice Department to investigate. Now, I don't know if the Justice Department has opened an investigation or the results of that investigation, but the complaint comes from a credible source, and we have included it in our complaint as part of the reason we know that the city had actual knowledge of some of the problems and failed to take remedial measures and corrective action. They knew that the police were not being disciplined for misconduct and didn't address it. And the result is additional misconduct like what we see with Ms. Perez. We know that training without enforcement is meaningless, but setting aside the issue of lack of enforcement, the city itself has some major training deficiencies, and one of them is in the area of training the officers to intervene and speak up when they see a fellow officer misbehaving or engaging in excessive force. In the complaint, we've listed a number of examples of where police officers were engaging in excessive force, and in the majority of them, there were other officers around who stood by silent, in some cases even laughing. And that needs to change. There has to be a cultural shift. There has to be additional training. Officers need to look out for each other. And when one of them is forgetting his training or engaging in some excessive force, the officer needs to step in and say, hey, let's calm down, let's rethink this. And that doesn't happen, and it certainly didn't happen in this case. In this case, you had multiple officers standing around as the situation escalated more and more. And when the officers pulled their weapon, nobody said, what are we doing? Let's back off. This woman's behind a locked door. Let's stand down. None of that happened. And it's because the city has a culture of whatever happens, happens. And that's got to change. Well, Chief McManus and the assistant chief have both explained that the proper thing to do in this case would have been for the police officers to simply leave. Let Miss Perez stay in her house and then do a well check the next morning to make sure she got the proper medical care. The worst thing they could have done is to escalate the situation by pointing a loaded gun at her and saying you're going to get shot. And so they should have just left. Clearly, the compensation in this case needs to be substantial. But we didn't allege a specific dollar amount in the complaint because we want the attention to be focused on the officers and what happened and what needs to be done to make sure this never happens again. Now, when you're looking at what an appropriate amount would be, you look at both the gravity of the harm sustained and the seriousness of the misconduct. And in this case, the harm is catastrophic. 4 children lost their mother, including 3 minors. And when you look at the gravity of the wrong, 3 police officers gunning a woman down in her own house is very significant. So only a substantial award would be justice in this case. A lot of people will say that you can't really armchair quarterback in these situations, that these officers make split-second decisions and they're life or death and we can't second guess them. And I'm sympathetic to that thought. It's just not the case that we have here. These officers had multiple opportunities to calm down and collaborate for an extended period of time. I mean, it was 50 minutes between the time the officer first got there and the time that you had that negative interaction where the officer said you're going to get shot. And then he backed off and they talked for another 22 minutes before Officer Alejandro crossed the threshold again and opened fire into her apartment with 5 shots. And then after that happened, somehow he missed because she was obviously not that close to him. There was time for them to say, stand down, put your gun away. What are you doing? And instead they doubled down. 2 other officers triangulated this woman and they fired in unison and they kept firing until they knew she was dead, at least 20 shots. SAPD had multiple opportunities to de-escalate. Instead, they continued to escalate in a way that was completely inappropriate. For starters, you didn't need an army of cops in this situation. She was walking her dog when the first one arrived. She was cutting wires at her house because she thought the FBI was spying on her. That's not the kind of thing that requires a platoon of officers. It's not a terrorist attack here. She goes into her house for more than an hour. At that point, the officer that comes as backup crosses the threshold, sticks his arm into her window, and she panics and throws a candle. He draws his weapon. The police regulations say you don't draw your weapon unless you can pull the trigger. Obviously, you shouldn't be pulling the trigger in this situation, so he should never have pulled his weapon. And then the first thing out of his mouth was, "You're going to get shot." He was thinking about shooting her from the get-go. That's just a completely inappropriate thing to say or think. Well, fortunately, he doesn't pull the trigger. He backs off. 22 minutes later, Officer Alejandro crosses the threshold. He can't get in the door because it's locked. He knows that this diminutive woman is no danger to anybody. What's she going to do, go attack that platoon of officers? No, but he still pulls his weapon, shoots 5 times into the apartment. He doesn't know where those bullets are going to go. Obviously, she's not that close because none of those bullets hit her. But those bullets could have gone through the wall. They could have struck anything. At that point, instead of saying, "Stand down, put your gun away," they double down. One officer pulls his gun from the back and doesn't pull the trigger, but 2 others cross the threshold, aim their gun, synchronize with Officer Alejandro, triangulate poor Miss Perez, and gun her down, and they continue to shoot. They shoot over and over and over until they're certain she's dead. Every shooting death is tragic, but when the police are the perpetrators, it changes things. The police have sworn an oath to protect and to serve, and when they're the ones that committed the murder, all of us are violated. Now, on top of that, Miss Perez was suffering from an acute mental health crisis. And so we need to examine, what do we do with someone who's experiencing a mental illness? Every one of us have a loved one or a friend who suffers from mental illness. I have a daughter who has special needs, and if somebody came to her house and acted the way these officers did, she would throw things, she would scream, especially if she was having one of her episodes. If she's in the wrong place at the wrong time, after watching this video, she could be the next Melissa Perez. All of us are in danger when the officers behave this way. And so it's about protecting our most vulnerable. It's about making sure that police have the proper training to handle people with mental illness. It's about making sure that when we trust a police officer to carry a deadly weapon, that they will only use it when it's absolutely necessary to protect the life of themselves or from somebody else. They need to treat that trust with an appropriate respect for the sanctity of life. And that did not happen in this case, and it can never happen again.